CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to a special edition of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beginko Moyo. Today, I'm really nervous. I'm nervous to be joined by Akwasi Aidoo. Akwasi Aidoo is the founding director, or was the founding director of Trust Africa. At one point, Akwasi and I worked very closely. He was my boss. Akwasi, welcome to the episode.
Thank you very much, Becky. And Becky, I'm a little anxious because
I'm the one who is anxious.
I'm talking to somebody who really has reached the mountaintop of philanthropy.
Thank you so much, Akwasi. So I think for us, the platform is really to help many others in the continent and beyond to understand the different manifestations and narratives on African philanthropy. Of course, we at times talk about global philanthropy and how it operates in the continent and elsewhere. But I think for me and the audience that we generate this content for is really to understand from those that have been leading in the sector in various ways their own take on the state of African philanthropy. And today we are here on the second day of our fourth conference on African philanthropy. And I would want us to start maybe first getting your thoughts on the state of African philanthropy or even philanthropy in Africa today.
Well, that's a very good question. African philanthropy is in the bones of Africa. It goes way, way back. And it's very intrinsic, embodied, embedded in African cultures and so on, practices, beliefs, values. So it's really not something from outside the continent that came in. And it has come a long way, therefore. When we look back, we see some landmarks that were really outstanding. Currently, I think it has spiked in many ways, and I'll mention three ways in which African philanthropy has spiked. The first is that it's really gone continental. It's gone beyond the community level. There are so many trans-African, trans-local exchanges, so many platforms, African philanthropic networks and infrastructure platforms that bring African philanthropic organizations and philanthropists across the continent together. And so that is a very important development today. The second is that it has actually grown in size, in numbers. There are many, many more African philanthropic institutions established more recently. And then the third is that African philanthropy is slowly and steadily getting global recognition and global attention. And that is also a good development.
Yeah, and a lot of that is attributed to a larger extent to colleagues and people like yourselves who served in various institutions that were working on the continent, either as lecturers, teachers, or as people who were working in foundations, or as medical sociologists, among other functions. And you are one of those people that a lot of us, when we think of philanthropy, we think of the work that you have done. Maybe we can take a look at some of the initiatives that you've been part of. And the most recent, for me, being Trust Africa. Maybe we can talk a bit about the emergence of Trust Africa, what led to Trust Africa. And the other day you were saying, I'm credited with the role of actually setting up Trust Africa, but actually there were a number of people behind it, one of them being Jerry. maybe the story of Trust Africa needs to be recorded. I know there are some write-ups about it, but maybe we can use this opportunity to chronicle it in a way as well.
Of Trust Africa
Trust
specifically.
Africa specifically, yes.
Yes, Trust Africa emerged out of an incubation period at the Ford Foundation. And in the late 1990s, the Ford Foundation's endowment had gone way up. And at that time, fortunately, there were more African regional directors of the Ford Foundation. In Johannesburg, for Southern Africa, there was Jerry Salol, for example. And I was also the regional director for West Africa, based in Lagos, Nigeria. And that was quite a development, because before I became the regional director, there were no African internationally recruited senior staff within the Ford Foundation. I was actually, at that time, the only one until Jerry also came on board. And when the Ford Foundation's endowment grew rapidly in the late 90s, there was a question, what can be done with the additional resources, funds that the Ford Foundation had received? And Jerry Solol and I and a few others came together, thought about different scenarios, and one scenario was for the Ford Foundation to support an African foundation startup. It was not the only African foundation at the time. The African Women's Development Fund, for example, existed. And the other national level foundations like KCDF, the Kenya Community Development Foundation, that also existed. But the idea was to have a Pan-African organization that was cutting across the field. In other words, AWDF was for women's rights, and Trust Africa, or this new foundation, will be something that covers a broad range of themes and issues. So the idea of Trust Africa came up, and we demanded, or requested rather, that there should be a 5-year incubation period. And that will be a period during which we will have a series, about 3 convenings a year, a series of convenings in 5 years across the continent, where we bring together African scholars, African policy makers, African advocates. And what we wanted to do was to really have a presence of different sectors to close what I call the RAP gaps: research, advocacy, and policy. And so, and we are civil society organization leaders who are advocates. We are academics who are also researchers. We had policymakers at the national and continental level, the African Union level. We had a series of convenings of these people. First one in Maputo in June 2002, followed by another in Addis Ababa, and we had one here in Senegal on Gorée Island. We had one in Kenya, Nairobi, in Egypt, Cairo, in so many places across, and then in Johannesburg, where the basic idea was, tell us, let's brainstorm, and you give us guidance about what this foundation will do, what it will look like, how it will be structured, how it will be staffed, what its strategy would be, what its shared values will be, and what its systems of operation would be. What I call the, not I, but the McKinsey group called the 7 S's: systems, strategy, structure, staff, shared values, and so on, would be for this organization. for this foundation to be born.
Yeah.
And also who and what the board of directors or board of governors would be, how it will look like, and what its role would be. So in many ways, it was curated. It was, of course, incubated, but the incubation comprised mostly of curation of ideas around the 7 systems to set up and where it would be. Because the basic idea was Africa is not a country. Africa is a huge continent, and we need to base it within Africa in a place that is easily connected to by others around the continent. And we had many places we were thinking about: Ghana, Ethiopia, South Africa, Senegal, and ultimately we chose Senegal because the government's policy at the time was very welcoming, where automatically it gave you what they call a diplomatic agreement, accord de siège, which allowed you to really operate and transfer funds for grant making from Senegal and from around the world without any restrictions and any taxation. So in a nutshell, that's a bit of the background of Trust Africa. And finally, the 3 major areas where the conveners, the convening participants highlighted were peace building and security, citizenship and regional integration, African philanthropy, and equitable, 4 of them rather, not 3, and equitable development.
So at some point I would want to talk about the early years of Trust Africa and some of the early beneficiaries of the support. But before then, I know that when I was at Trust Africa, we used to hear from you about the process of naming Trust Africa. A lot of people always wonder, how did you end up with the name Trust Africa, and what does it really signify or symbolize? But I know there was an elaborate process around that.
There was indeed an elaborate process, and it was also one of the things that we brainstormed during the convenings. It always came up at the beginning and at the end of convenings. But there wasn't really an easy solution. We had a convening in New York with some Ford Foundation leaders, and the Africans within the Ford Foundation, Jerry Salo, Tade Aina, myself, Natalia, and others. And we brainstormed, and ultimately we thought it should have a name that has Africa in it, because the Africa focus, African continental focus, or I would say Pan-African focus, was at the core of it. So Africa was supposed to be in the name. And we had different options like the African Foundation for X, Y, and Z. We have, and then of course, the idea of foundation was also considered bad with a question mark on it. Because the idea was that foundation may not necessarily convey the DNA, the purpose of this entity. So we thought instead of foundation, we'll use the word trust. So it could have been the African Trust Fund. And Tade Aina said the idea of fund was suggested by Jerry Salo. And then Tade Aina instinctively, it was an aha moment for all of us, said, well, that's good. So why don't we combine Trust Africa and Trust? And instead of having Africa first, we have Trust, and then we have Africa, which will give it double meaning. One is an African trust, but the other is we should all trust Africa,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
has to do with
Yeah.
the recognition of African
Yeah.
agency
Yeah.
in all the work that
Yeah.
this entity would do. So we ended up with the name Trust Africa.
Yeah.
And there was one colleague who was not African, Emma Playfair, who was at the meeting, and she said, well, why don't you consider combining the two words into a single word?
Yeah.
So instead of having trust,
In Africa.
space,
Yeah.
Africa, why don't you just say Trust Africa?
Yeah.
And that gave it a third kind of meaning,
Yeah.
which is that trust in Africa, or trust is embedded in
In
Africa.
Africa, yeah.
And
Which,
Africa should be embedded in your trust.
which suggests that at that moment there could have been debates around maybe the plight of Africans, whether they should be trusted or not trusted, the flow of resources. It sounds like the name was in a way utilized to actually respond to some of those debates.
Yes, and the idea was, look, Africans have agency and understanding of their context and culture. And even though we have different languages, we've got the same historical experiences across the board, and we don't really need a dictionary to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that definitely
Yeah.
was one.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other was that Africans themselves must have self-trust. And that's on the demand side of the
Yeah.
equation.
Yeah.
The supply side of the equation is where is the request or the quest for philanthropies and foreign global north aid agencies to respect Africans and Africa and African agency. And the second aspect was Africans to really recognize and respect themselves because, as you know, Steve Biko made a very important statement which has philanthropic element in it. He said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Africans trusting the continent and its own agency handles that.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, that takes me to the symbols that then you adopted, one of them being the famous tree. And I think there's a story again around that. So I would want us to also get your own narration of that, because you were really at the heart of it.
Yes, my memory of it is not as sharp.
Yeah.
But we launched Trust Africa here in Senegal after we decided to locate the head office here. And we had the leaders of Senegal come, including the president and others, on 6th of June 2006. And one of the conversations on the sidelines and even within the launch was what should be its symbol. And if I remember correctly, we had a lot of ideas coming up. The one that stuck with me was the idea of a baobab tree, of a tree
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
stands tall, but it's also part of the forest. It's not in isolation.
Yeah.
But there are other renditions of where that symbol
Yeah.
came up.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, one would now look back, and I know it's been a couple of years since you also left Trust Africa, but you still stayed close to that. I mean, have we stayed true to that symbol and what it signified?
Yes, I think Trust Africa has stayed true to its DNA in many ways. One is that, of course, it is a tree, a tall tree, but it's part of the forest.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Trust Africa's connections with other African foundations has grown and deepened. The other is has more to do with its programmatic focus. it still focuses on many of the key areas that set it up, or that it was focused on at the beginning: peace building and equitable development and philanthropy and so on. And then thirdly, it has been very successful in, I have several elements of success that I can talk about later, but one of them was ensuring that Africa was not donor dependent, broadening its donor base. Of course, that's always an ongoing need. So in many ways, yes.
Yeah. I mean, as an institutional builder yourself, because you really set up Trust Africa, of course, with the support of others, to where it is today. Are there any key, rather let me rephrase and say, what were the key moments for you in the journey of Trust Africa when you were at its helm?
When
you were at its helm as the executive director?
Yeah, key moments, positive or negative?
Both.
Well, there have been many key moments, as you know, from with almost every organization, with every human being. There are moments, things that come and go. It's always like the waves of the ocean: high tide, low tide, steady tide. So some of them were, one, our success really in getting attention of other major global funders, global North donors. And partly a moment that led to that, or not led to that, that symbolized that, was when I was invited to be on the international advisory board of the Council on Foundations in Washington, D.C. The Council on Foundations is the largest and most influential platforms, philanthropic platforms. All the American foundations are members of it. And so to be invited because of Trust Africa, or my presence in Trust Africa, I think was really a great thing, that recognition. And then the World Bank also set up GAPSI. And GAPSI is Global Partnerships for Inclusive Governance, or something like that. It's still in existence, and they asked me to join their board and so on. So that was good. The second moment, of course, was when Trust Africa received requests from a couple of major donors who could directly fund, but said, would you re-grant for us? And that meant their recognition of the fact that Trust Africa had proximity to where the problems are, and knowledge of the context, and so on. And one of them was IDRC, the Canadian Government Funding Agency, International Development Research Center, that came with an idea of, it was called ICBE. I've forgotten exactly.
I think it was Investment,
Climate and Business Environment. ICB, Investment, Climate and Business Environment, and that was several $1 million. We got a request from the Gates Foundation, which for something on agriculture, which we did. We got from Open Society Foundations, the MacArthur Foundation for some re-granting work on international criminal justice, from the Carnegie Corporation, Oak Foundation, Secret Foundation. So those were very key moments where that recognition was expressed, or you know.
And then from the political, I would say the political front, obviously Trust Africa was operating in a continent where different regions were experiencing different political moments. And I know that there was a focus on democracy and governance in the very early part of Trust Africa, including the peace and security
Yes.
themes. Are there any other specific moments there that come to your mind, especially in the early beginnings of Trust Africa?
Yes, democratic governance part of Trust Africa's work was kind of an intersection with the peace and security
Yeah.
bit, because the basic idea was to ensure that you can have peaceful elections and voices of the ordinary people could be heard and so on. And that led to, for example, in Liberia, when Sheriff Johnson was elected president.
Yeah.
We got a call, I got a call from the founder of Humanity United, where I currently serve as senior fellow, to say we will very much like to support her or her government, because it's a real milestone in a post-conflict country where there is, we think, need for more support. And we define it more as catalyzing the conditions for thriving civil society organizations that will be a key element in democratic governance and peace building. And so we did that. We had what we call the ZIM initiative, Zimbabwe initiative, and other donors also came on board for that. And that also connected, it was in the intersection of peace and democracy.
And then, of course,
and many others.
I mean, during that time, especially when you were still the executive director, you were also part of the startup of several other initiatives. The first one, if my memory serves me right, you were the first co-chair of EGAG.
Yes.
How did Trust Africa get involved, and what were the implications? Right, maybe not implications, but what were the expected outcomes in participating in EGAG?
Well, EGAG emerged during the incubation period of Trust Africa in New York, at which point it was actually not, as you know, not called Trust Africa. It was a special initiative for Africa before Trust Africa was spun off with its own name and location. And at that point, when EGAG was being established, there was a recognition that even though it's not an African grant makers affinity group, rather it was Africa. Africa Grant Makers Affinity Group, meaning to be an affinity group of grant makers focused on Africa, which have Africa as part of their geographic domains of focus. And most of them, of course, were American foundations. But there was a recognition that if it is Africa focused, we've got to have African presence. And having African presence meant having African people in a steering committee, on the board, to start. So that's how I got involved. And we set it up together with colleagues across foundations. At that time, I was the only African on it, but eventually it expanded very wide. And I think it was very good, because what it did overall was to ensure that this would not be something always done in the United States, where it was headquartered, with a focus on Africa. But that this will be something done in terms of its convenience and so on within Africa itself. So most of its convenings were in Africa.
Yeah.
And the other, of course, was that even though there are many African foundations that were not members of it
Yeah.
at the beginning,
Yeah.
but going forward, there will be African inclusion or inclusion of African philanthropic institutions
Yeah.
on AGAG.
Yeah.
Yes. I
And-
think those two elements.
And as we speak today, they've reached a conclusion that its role, they've achieved what it was sought to do, and so by October they're winding it up.
Yes.
And so that speaks also to some of the work that was done with your participation and others. But the other one is the Africa Grantmakers Network, which is now the Africa Philanthropy Network.
Yes.
Again, Trust Africa almost acted as the host of that. Again, I would want us to get your thoughts on why was that important and what we sought to achieve during that time and the role that Trust Africa played.
Yes. When Trust Africa was established, as I said, there were a few African foundations, AWDF, KCDF. There was even the East African Philanthropy Network, and so on. And what we wanted, again, making a forest out of the trees, was to find out how we can learn from each other, how we can support each other, how we can together work. So supporting each other, learning from each other, and working together will require a platform. Otherwise, what you have is bilateral engagements. So having a collective engagement was really the reason for the African Grantmakers Affinity Group. And the AWDF at the time, it was BC who was there, and so on. And we got together and got it going. And it was a good effort to catalyze and cultivate the conditions for all the learning, exchanges, and collaborative work that we see happening today.
In fact, as we speak, they are part of this conversation today. And the last one, which most people don't really make a connection, is the African Union Foundation. African Union Foundation.
Yes.
Which I think at that time, maybe through the support of Bishop Malusi, who was part of the board, we were then, as Trust Africa, invited to assist with the formation of the African Union Foundation. Again, lots of trips to Addis for you and many colleagues. Why was that also part of an important component of philanthropy and this infrastructure in the continent from the perspective of Trust Africa and its leadership?
Yes, the idea was that you have several sectors. You have the private sector, some of which have their own foundations, the Tony Elumelu Foundation, the Danjuma Foundation, and so on. These are private sector people or organizations. And then you have quotation marks, the non-profit foundations like Trust Africa, AWDF, and so on. And another area or sector really is the continental, across the continent and across sub-regions. So the idea was, if we're going to be engaged with, especially at the policy level, then ECOWAS and East African Community and SADC, and at the time SADC was a bit active, and the African Union overall at the continental level needed to be engaged. So we had a meeting with Nkosazana.
Yes, Nkosazana Dlamini
Nkosazana, when she was the of the African Union. In fact, she invited us Jerry Salo, Malusi, myself, I can't remember who else. We went to a home in Addis.
Yeah.
And one of the ideas was there's a need for a foundation. It's one thing to connect directly with African foundations, and there's another thing that can be done, which is having an African Union Foundation, which brings all the key policy leaders to the table for interactions.
Yeah. And so, I mean, as we begin to wind down, people always hear about Akwasi Aidoo, and everyone, I mean, I'm awed all the time when I see you and I speak highly because I worked with you and I know the work that you have done. But some people might know the name and not know much about who the person is. So maybe in almost like a storytelling manner, where did it start for Akwasi? Who is Akwasi? What has been the journey like for you?
Well, my grandmother was a philanthropist herself within our community. Right. In other words, rather a philanthropy leader, because she never went to school and so on. This was way back, beginning of the last century. But she always brought women together to support each other, to have activities together, like have a farm that they all owned, and support each other when there were funerals and so on. So many other philanthropic expressions. So growing up, I learned a lot from her. And as of course I grew up and went to university and so on, my philanthropic journey really began in the early 80s. I was at the University of Connecticut doing my PhD, and of course I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement within the United States, and we always went to the UN building demonstrating with placards, Free Mandela, End Apartheid, and so on. And once while I was there, I went with my South African professor, Ben Magubane, and he introduced me to the ANC country representative in Tanzania, called Stanley Mabizela.
Okay.
Senior comrade Stanley Mabizela. So I went to him and I said, Senior comrade, I really would love to be engaged with the ANC in one way or the other, including even joining MK, Mkoto Wisizwe.
Yeah.
And she said, no, you've got a PhD. How can you be in MK?
Yeah.
It's not a good idea. And also you are not South African. So I said, well, any other philanthropic contributions I can make, I'm more than happy to help. So the suggestion from him was, well, why don't you come to Tanzania? And while there, because Tanzania, in addition to Zambia, Dar es Salaam, in addition to Lusaka, was kind of a head office, headquarters.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was one of the head office. The main head office of the ANC was in Lusaka.
Yeah.
But in Tanzania, they had MK, camps, and they also had SOMAFCO, the Solomon Malangu Freedom College.
Yeah.
Which was a place where young South Africans who had left, exiled themselves from South Africa, went for education, SOMAFCO. So he says, if you come to Tanzania, you don't even have to be teaching, employed at SOMAFCO, but maybe University of Dar es Salaam. And then every week we'll come pick you up, you go to Mazimbu, Morogoro, where SOMAFCO was based, and you help these young ones with their education and any other support that you can organize for them. So that was really the beginning of my philanthropic journey. And at that time also, George Soros had started maybe a year or two earlier his philanthropic
Yeah.
work,
Yeah.
this was before OSF was established, and it was focused on scholarships for young black South Africans in apartheid South Africa. So I helped with that as well, the Soros Scholarships Fund, but I was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam. So I'll teach them Monday to Wednesday, and Thursday, Friday, weekend, I'll be in Mazimbu.
Yeah.
And then I left and came to Senegal in 1988 and joined IDRC, the Canadian Funding Organization, International Development Research Center. And then from there joined the Ford Foundation. I was with IDRC till December 1992, from 1988. And then joined the Ford Foundation and moved on from there. And the rest is history.
And right now, you said you are the senior fellow
at Humanity
United. I would want us to end by getting some thoughts, not really thoughts, but really understanding how you are helping an international American foundation to do its work, especially in Africa, more effectively. Because my view is that, with the kind of person that they have in you, it's really the wisdom that a foundation would be benefiting from you. How has it been over the last couple of years? And what are the key areas that you focus on when you are working with a big foundation like Humanity United?
Yes, you use the word wisdom, and they use that word a lot. But I always say it's not wisdom; it's more to do with knowledge and network. And what I bring to Humanity United as a senior fellow over the last 9 years is knowledge and context, connections, network, African network for their work in Africa. They are focused on two main areas: peace building and human rights. And in Africa, the idea is to help them with their strategy regarding the countries where they work or they plan to work. They've worked in many countries, in post-conflict countries, in conflict zones, in the two Congos, in Central African Republic, in Chad, in Somalia, in South Sudan, you name it, Zimbabwe included. So what I do is help them to get a better understanding of the context and implementation needs for their strategy and funding. And also to help broaden their network within Africa. And the network part, a lot more needs to be done. In fact, on both parts, a lot more needs to be done. But one big success is that they have finally got some African staff members. Before there were none. And I'm still the only senior fellow from Africa. There are only two of us. But the idea is to really for them to diversify and have more African presence.
Akwasi, you've inspired so many people and initiatives. One of which is, let me just take a couple of them. So one is Rose Maruru, who has gone up to set up Epic Africa. Tendai Murisa, who has set up Civil Institute. I have gone on to set up a center on philanthropy and social investment, in which you serve as an advisory board member. And many other Trust Africa affiliated staff or board members are also in different influential places. Natalia with the UN United Nations, Tadia with MasterCard, Jerry with the EU Africa Foundation, previously with the EFC, etc., etc.
Yes.
And I really wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for inspiring us. Every time I think back at what I'm doing, I always see you. I always see you in the Memos office and in our second office, and just coming to ask for wisdom. And here we are now. I'm really appreciative of the time that you have given to the sector, to me personally, and to all other colleagues who might not have the opportunity to meet you and say thank you. Really, thank you so much, Akwasi.
Thank you. And I've also learned a lot from you.
Yeah.
So it's been accompaniment.
Yeah.
It's a two-sided thing.
Right.
But yeah, thank you. And of course, I'm the oldest
Yes.
in all of this group of people
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
mentioned.
yes,
In fact, even
yes.
at this conference, I'm the oldest person because at 73 years old,
Yeah.
there are many people here who are the age of my older son.
Right.
And so I really learn a lot from that generation,
Yeah.
the younger generation.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot, and I still learn a lot. But
Yeah.
thank you.
I want to end with my final request. We use the word wisdom. What would be your advice to me as I try to build this center on knowledge generation, training, among others?
Well, wisdom is a good word. It's not a bad word.
Yeah.
And it embodies knowledge, of course, and embodies humility. But overall, I think wisdom has to do with a combination of hindsight, insight, and foresight. And so that's why in African cultures we call the old people people of wisdom, because they have so much hindsight.
Yeah.
And many of the younger ones, they were not around when a lot of the wahala in the past were happening.
Yeah.
So they have no hindsight.
Yeah.
But they have got a lot of foresight because they are really about the future.
The future, yeah.
So I think wisdom is when you are the three and it comes as you experience.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of wisdom as a result.
Yeah.
Because you've achieved a lot, written books,
Right.
and you've got a lot of insight, and your foresight is shining.
Thank you, Akwasi. That was Akwasi Aidoo, the founding director of Trust Africa and currently serving as a senior fellow at Humanity United. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.